Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 2 of Symbolic Communication and Cartography. Last week we talked about setting and verisimilitude and maps, and this week we are talking about culture and civilization. Now, you may be asking yourself, why are we talking about this? Well, the culture of the world that you create is just as much a part of the setting as the landscape and everything else. And going by the first week's keynote, you'll notice that everything is interchangeable. Culture, setting, land, environment, language, hierarchy, all of these things go together. And so that's why we're studying it this week. So this week we're going to look at two cultures in particular. We're going to be looking at ancient Egypt and modern Japan. Now, the reason that we're doing this is because looking at other cultures can help you get ideas for making your own culture more interesting and vivid and vibrant and alive. Also, if you are actually writing a story set in modern Japan or ancient Egypt, you better get your facts right. And so research is incredibly important. The way that I like to approach it is through the metaphor of cooking. And I like to use the example of making a stew. Now, when you make a stew, you have to have certain ingredients. You have to have water or some sort of stock. You have to have your meat and vegetables and all that other good stuff. All of that is very important. You have to have that because they provide the nutrients and proteins and everything else that you need in order to, gain sustenance. However, if all you had was the stock and the meat and the potatoes, then it's probably not going to be a very memorable meal. And what you need to include in order to make it memorable are spices. Add a little salt or pepper or paprika or onion powder or something like that, because it's going to give your stew more flavor and it's going to give it more life and it's going to make it much more memorable. And so when we look at these different civilizations, that's kind of how we're approaching it. With ancient Egypt, we are looking at the very base ingredients because without them, you don't have a stew. When we look at modern day Japan, we're looking at the little details because, it's the little details that make it interesting and memorable. So, to return to our definition of culture, culture is the intersection of 5 different elements: environment, language, hierarchy, law, and religion. And as I said before, we are going to be focusing on ancient Egypt. Specifically, we're going to look at how the environment shaped the culture, the language, hierarchy, law, religion, all of them shape the culture. The Greek historian Herodotus called Egypt the gift of the Nile. And the importance of this river cannot be overstated. Water is the basic building block of life. Water is what we have to have in order to survive. You can't live 3 days without water, otherwise, you will dehydrate and you will die. Water means life for you, it means life for your crops and your farm animals. Water is also key for trade and commerce because until the invention of the wheel and the motorized cart, and definitely the invention of air travel, a great deal of goods were transported through water, which is why most major cities are located at ports or near water. It's not just because you need water to survive, but also because they make this location makes them a central hub for commerce of that area. And so the Nile is incredibly important. Egypt is a dry, arid landscape, and so you have water is a even more precious commodity there than any other place. And in terms of farmable land, of habitable areas, it's a very, very small section of land that is livable in that area, specifically the river delta. The rest of the land is made up of sandstone and hard rock and other minerals and earth types that are not sustainable, not suitable for agriculture, which is what allows us to stay in one place, have greater sources of food, and thrive and build community, build cities. So continuing with speaking of the environment, let's move on to weather. Weather, as you might imagine, is pretty harsh in Egypt. The desert is very hot. There really are only two seasons, summer and winter. I mean, they have periods of transition, but they're very brief, and the change in temperature and weather conditions are very slight. So when you're think about how this would affect how people lived. How would they dress to deal with the weather? How would they build their houses? How would they interact? What times of day would they go out? All of these aspects of everyday living are going to be affected by the weather. Moving on to language. Ancient Egyptian has the second longest history in terms of languages. The only language that is older, that is recorded, and we still know about is Sumerian. Now, ancient Egyptian had 5 phases, which we're not going to go into here. For more information, you can refer to the PDF copy of this, which has a lot more information. But what is interesting is that in terms of their written language, there were 2 forms. The first form was hieroglyphics, which you can see here on the slide. Now, hieroglyphics were used exclusively for very important ritualistic events, and so they were reserved for tombs and religious areas and whatnot. There was an everyday form, though, called hieratic, which, if you look at it, actually looks a little bit like Arabic, which is not surprising because it's the same general area. And certainly, there was some trading going on and some dissemination of the Egyptian culture into the wider area. And so, hieratic was used by everyday scribes, and it was written out on paper, and it was used for just any and everything. You needed to write a note. You needed to keep track of grain or other goods and services. You would use hieratic because, drawing bird, dancy guy, whatever, would just be ridiculous. The hierarchy of ancient Egypt is very interesting, and in fact, it looks very similar, at least on a cursory glance, to the social setup of medieval Europe. At the very top, you had the pharaoh, whose title translates as great house or great home. And the pharaoh was more of a figurehead than an actual legislator and ruler. The pharaoh's existence was more important than his actions in many real sense. He was the spiritual leader. His health and success were key for the health and success of both the land and of their spiritual lives as well. So it's not to say that the pharaoh did not have influence, but in terms of everyday governing, that was delegated to other people, including the vizier, who, in the sense, kind of functioned as the prime minister, who had office over kind of the everyday workings of the empire. And underneath the vizier were nomarchs, and they're kind of the equivalent of earls and dukes and whatnot, where they were given land. Egypt was divided into 42 nomes, Nomes, that they're like little fiefdoms almost, and over each nome was a nomarch, and the nomarch would then answer to themselves, to the vizier, and then to finally the pharaoh. So that's just a very basic understanding of the social structure there, and as is often the case, the population distribution, most of the people in Egypt were slaves or farmers or craftspeople. and only the very fortunate 1% were in positions of wealth and power, and these positions were hereditary. You could not earn them. You couldn't go to school to learn to be a vizier or a nomarch or whatnot. You were either born into it or you weren't. And if you weren't, then it just sucks to be you, to put it crudely. Law is interesting. There were two basic courts in ancient Egypt. There was the Kenbet and the Great Kenbet. The Kenbet was kind of like your equivalent to small claims court. Let's say that I was a farmer and you were a sheep herder, and I said, "Oh, okay, I'll give you 3 sheep. I'll give you 3 bundles of wheat for 1 sheep," and so we exchange, but instead of giving me a full grown sheep, you give me a baby sheep or something that I didn't ask for. So I would take you to the small Kenbet, and it would be resolved there. The great Kenbet was presided over by the pharaoh and the vizier, and it was for major issues, usually issues of state and treason and things like that. So, as is often the case, justice was really kind of centered around the people in power. And so, a lot of what you would see in terms of court cases and stuff like that, the people in power would usually win. Moving on to religion, our final aspect. Egypt was a polytheistic society. This means that they believed in many different deities. And as is the case with most polytheistic societies, or probably all of them really, each god had reign over a certain aspect of life, the universe, and everything else. So you would have the god of the sun, the god of the dead, you had the god of funerals, and the god of knowledge, and scribes, and things like that. And so it's a very interesting religion. It certainly permeated our popular culture. And one of the more interesting things about it, if you study it, is how the gods and goddesses changed over time. Their stories changed, their aspects changed. Sometimes they were conveyed or portrayed, I should say, as having human bodies and animal heads. Sometimes they were portrayed as being fully human, and it kind of depended over time and influence and everything else. And so it's a fascinating religion, and it's one that can really make for great fodder for your stories. So this brings us to the end of the presentation. I didn't want to go overly long because, your time is valuable. So I just touched on really the big high points. And if you want to go into more detail, there is a PDF copy of this slideshow that you can watch, that you can read through, and it's more text heavy and it has a lot more information. But even then, it's just scratching the surface. This is just to give you a basic idea of the different elements, and hopefully you can put them together and to get a picture of how this culture works. And that's vitally important in your own work. You have to understand how your culture works, whether it is a culture that you're creating from the fly or if it's one that you live in. Sometimes the hardest thing to do is to take what we are familiar with and look at it through the eyes of a stranger. But once you're able to do that, you're going to be able to analyze it, piece it apart, figure out how and why it works, and then you can put that into your story. It's going to make it much more believable, which again comes back to our key word from last week, which is verisimilitude. So I hope this has been informative, and this leads us into the presentation on Japan, which again is going to be about the little details, the spices. So I look forward to seeing you there. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please let me know.